This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In his new book, veteran higher education journalist and ProPublica editor Daniel Goldin builds a compelling case that the globalization of American universities has made them fertile territory for espionage. The book is Spy Schools: How the CIA, the FBI, and foreign intelligence secretly exploit American universities. Daniel Goldin joins us now. Dan, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Emily.
Why are college campuses such ripe territory for this kind of espionage?
Well, there's any number of reasons. In the first place, college campuses are typically very accessible places. There's not as much security, and people can go into a cafeteria or a library or a seminar and start chatting with the person next to them who might be a scientist or a researcher or somebody who used to be or will become a government official. So there's an awful lot of access. And then also, universities don't pay an awful lot of attention to intellectual property issues. It's pretty much only law schools that have intellectual property classes. People who are going to be making inventions and are scientific graduate students may not know very much about patent protections and other kinds of protections. In general, universities, they're very eager for international collaborations, international prestige. They may have campuses abroad. And so they rarely enter into formal collaborative agreements that spell out what, say, researchers from China or Russia who come to the U.S., what they might have access to, what data they might be able to see and what they can't see. It's a kind of an old gentleman's handshake agreement situation. And that can easily be exploited if people want to steal research.
You have a chapter where you talk about what happened at Duke University specifically. There was some Pentagon-funded research in a very complicated cloaking technology that would actually allow military vehicles to be invisible to radar. And it was sort of stunning to me because you have to be incredibly smart to be working on that. But then the professor was also incredibly naive. Tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Well, what happened was a Chinese graduate student named Ruopeng Liu came to Duke to join Professor David Smith's lab, which, as you say, was working on Pentagon-funded invisibility research. And Liu proceeded in a variety of ways to essentially poach this research. He arranged for a collaboration with Chinese scientists who came in and photographed the equipment. He deceived the professor into signing a commitment to China to go over and share research there. He gained access to data that American graduate students had gathered. And eventually the professor at Duke got wise to it, but it was a little too late. He took away his key to the lab, but Duke did allow him to receive his PhD. And he went back to China, and with government funding, he opened a competing business and institute and became a billionaire back in China.
I was sort of blown away by this. I mean, I guess they gave him his degree and off he went. And I couldn't help but feel like this Duke professor had just been really duped. Do you feel like there was at least a learning experience there? Did anything change?
I think it was a learning experience for him. He tells me he's more skeptical, but he's by nature a very nice, trusting person. He believes very much in international collaborations and in, science as kind of a worldwide enterprise, a fellowship. In this case, he was taken advantage of. And to the extent that he consulted other Duke professors or administrators, his contention would be that they weren't really ready to back him up in doing any kind of drastic action. Duke has a campus in China. It was just getting that off the ground at the time. And I think that probably the last thing anybody at Duke wanted was to make us think about possible espionage or research theft by a Chinese graduate student. And ultimately, it took a warning from the Pentagon, a letter from them, to wake Duke up.
You looked at Ivy League schools, so there's Harvard and Princeton. Those are places that have been training grounds for U.S. intelligence for decades. And you certainly must have some deep sources from your years on the beat. But how did you actually go about figuring out these relationships and getting the data to make this case?
I used a number of reporting tactics. One was public records requests. I realized that if I sent records requests to the CIA and FBI, for example, asking for their dealings with American universities, I wouldn't get a reply for years and years. But I sent public records requests to dozens of American state universities asking for their communications with the CIA and the FBI. And some of what I got back was very helpful. In fact, it pointed me to the Duke case we just discussed, because one of the things the university sent me was the agenda of an outfit called the National Security Higher Education Advisory Board, a government board that looks at intelligence issues in higher education. And it turned out that the Duke professor was on one of the agendas speaking about the theft of his research by a Chinese graduate student. So I followed that up, but the public records request gave me the initial tip on that. In other cases, I have a chapter about how the CIA has for decades placed agents undercover in the Harvard Kennedy School's mid-career program. And I got a tip on that. And then I went back through 40 years of rosters in this mid-career program, which is a program predominantly for foreign officials, bureaucrats, rising leaders, with some Americans of equivalent status. And I looked back at all these things and I identified the people who said that their backgrounds were Foreign Service Officer, State Department Political Officer, State Department Economic Officer in different embassies abroad. And then I realized that those are sometimes covers for the CIA. And then I checked out those people to see, in later life, did it turn out that they had been in the CIA? And of course, I found a whole bunch of examples of people who had gone to the Kennedy School, said in this roster that they were working for the State Department, they were diplomats, but were actually CIA, who, of course, by being in this program, were able to cultivate potential foreign sources who were their classmates.
Did anyone try to keep you from reporting any part of this story based on national security concerns?
It's funny, the CIA, while they weren't helpful, they weren't hostile either. The FBI was pretty hostile, and they were not happy with my reporting, partly because some of the book came out of a Bloomberg article about how the FBI had tried to pressure a Chinese-born professor at the University of South Florida to spy on China for us. So the FBI, they knew the coverage wasn't going to be that favorable, and they sent out emails to people around the country telling them not to cooperate with me. And I also had kind of a tense meeting with the FBI people in Washington. But, that comes with the territory, and I would say it was nothing that unusual or that intimidating. The other thing that came up was that I had sent one of my public records requests to the New Jersey Institute of Technology. I said, do you have any communications with the FBI or the CIA? And they said, oh, yes, we have 5,000 pages of communications with the FBI and we'll send them right over. But when the package arrived, it was only, maybe 75 pages and most of them were redacted. And so it turned out that what had happened was that the FBI had sent several agents, I think 6 or 8, to the New Jersey Institute of Technology campus who had gone through all the documents and systematically redacted pretty much everything. And we ended up suing the New Jersey Institute of Technology. It then turned around and sued and blamed the FBI. And it became kind of a 3-ring circus, which was ultimately settled with me getting most of the pages, but not all of them.
We're talking with Daniel Golden about his new book, Spy Schools, now out in paperback. This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the American Federation of Teachers. AFT was founded in 1916 and today represents 1.7 million members in education, health, and public service. Visit AFT.org for more information. EWA retains all editorial control over programming and content. Dan, we talked a little bit about what some of the U.S. intelligence agencies are doing. I want to flip over to the other half of your book, where you found some really surprising examples of foreign agencies making use of what I guess I would call American goodwill. Let's talk about Marietta College in Marietta, Georgia.
To me, that was maybe the most bizarre thing of all that I found. There's a university in China called the University of International Relations, which seems to all intents and purposes like a normal university, but actually it's at least partly supervised and funded by Chinese intelligence, the Chinese Ministry of State Security. And what I found was it had this very close partnership with Marietta College, this tiny liberal arts college in Ohio. And Marietta was sending faculty over to teach the students at UIR, some of whom will make up the bulk of China's spies in future. And UIR was sending professors over to be, guest faculty at Marietta. And there were all these exchanges on both sides with one interesting exception, which is that while UIR sent students to Marietta, Marietta didn't send students to UIR because the students knew, and they were told by their professors, if they studied at UIR, they could never work for the U.S. government because the State Department is well aware that UIR is connected to Chinese intelligence. And in fact, there were people at Marietta who knew that too, They just looked the other way because UIR was a very valuable source of students. Marietta got a lot of income from Chinese students, and it has a relatively small endowment. So Marietta, for financial reasons, chose to look the other way.
Are they still looking the other way after the book has come out?
I haven't kept up in recent months, but as of the last time I checked, nothing much had changed, and they had agreements with UIR that ran well into the future, and I haven't seen anything about those being canceled.
This is a deeply researched book. It required some serious investigative reporting chops, which you obviously have. But I also feel like this had to have been something of a passion project for you. I want to understand a little bit about how your personal and career paths prepared you to write this book.
Yeah, it was a passion project. I mean, I think any book that you really care deeply about often has its roots early in life. In my case, of course, I grew up in higher education. My parents were both professors at UMass Amherst. And also, I had kind of an early interest in spying, or at least spy literature. I read a lot of John le Carré and Eric Ambler. And I also think that investigative reporting, in a way, has a little of both. You know, you do the kind of deep research that you'd associate with academia, and at the same time, there's a certain cloak and dagger element to it, too. I mean, when I was young and starting out as a reporter at the Boston Globe, we were still allowed to go undercover and pretend not to be reporters to gather information. I mean, that's not allowed anymore and hasn't been for a long time, but I did some of that. And so, you know, in a way, my journalistic background and my family background both led me to have a curiosity about this. And the other thing I'd say is when I was growing up in the 70s, it was a time of a lot of student protest against intelligence agencies on campus. So if the CIA and FBI were recruiting at UMass, you could count on some protests going on there. And that made an impression on me. And, you know, I'm a child of that era and I sympathized with the protesters. And in a way, you know, I was shocked in that I found something much worse, I thought, at the Kennedy School, you know, CIA agents going there undercover to cultivate unwitting foreign officials. But it didn't seem to resonate in our society as much as it would have 40, 50 years ago, which just shows how much has changed. I mean, academia has become so much more accepting of domestic intelligence agencies infiltrating higher education than it once was. Those are the kind of motivations, both personal and political, that led me to write this book.
Well, your book does cross a number of decades and a lot of eras, if you will, in sort of the techniques and approach to some of this spying. You talk about how, you know, an unusually high Xeroxing bill or paper usage might be a tip-off that somebody was smuggling some documents out. Now it's all done electronically. Is it really possible to stop? Is there a solution here?
It's hard to know whether it's possible to stop because nobody's really trying to. I mean, there are obviously some reforms that universities should at least attempt. For example, in the Duke case, if there had been a much more formal collaboration agreement between the Duke researchers and the Chinese collaborators, it would have been harder for them to simply waltz in and grab the data and photograph the equipment and everything else. That's one possibility. Another possibility would be more courses on intellectual property for science students and, you know, future holders of patents. That might be helpful in improving sophistication. Another might be simply penalizing people who are caught spying, either if they're caught while they're students, expelling them, or if it turns out when they're alumni that they spied while they were students, taking away their degrees. And, you know, that doesn't always happen. I mean, some of the Russian illegals who were caught spying, one of them had gone to Columbia Business School under a false name, false identity, false background. Columbia Business School never rescinded her degree. So I think universities don't take it really seriously. And until they do, we don't know whether taking it seriously would be effective or not.
I'm curious because there's been a lot reported recently about the downturn in international student enrollment in the U.S. Some people blame it on the so-called Trump effect. Others say, you know, it's just one of those peaks and now we're in a valley. Has anyone talked about this as a potential problem for these U.S. intelligence agencies and that it's maybe going to reduce the pool of candidates of folks who could be helpful to them down the road?
I think it could be an issue for them. I totally agree, particularly with countries like Iran that doesn't really have a diplomatic presence. So Iranian students are perhaps Iran's major way to spy in the U.S. They also may be our major sources for information on Iran. So it cuts both ways, but that's important. I do think that some of the talk about cutting down on international enrollment is getting out of hand. You hear rumblings now from the administration, well, maybe we should ban all Chinese students. And I'm like, oh my God, what have I done here? I mean, my view would be that, there's a small but significant number of Chinese students and researchers who are probably stealing research at American universities, as in the Duke example I portrayed. But there's a far greater number. They get their doctorates and then they stay in this country for years, or they make their whole career here. And the inventions and the energy that they bring to their work help the U.S. economy and the U.S. technological edge, not China's. In that sense, China almost has to spy just to make up some of the balance. I mean, the brain drain to the U.S. is one of the biggest benefits we have, and to get rid of that unilaterally would really be counterproductive.
I'm going to ask you to put on your editor's hat for a moment. What are a few story ideas for reporters who may be intrigued by this idea of espionage on campus?
Well, I would say that one story idea might be the one that you just kind of suggested. What is the impact of the restrictions on international student enrollment, or the Trump effect, as you mentioned it, on intelligence activity in both directions, both domestic and foreign? Is it having the effect of reducing foreign intelligence gathering, or is it hampering the FBI and the CIA in finding potential sources? That's one angle. Another angle that I tried to explore, but I didn't quite have time to look into, is that I got the impression that some programs that portray themselves as bringing persecuted scientists from abroad to the U.S., helping them as refugees or as mistreated scientists, may be partly altruistic on our part, but there's also an element of, if we bring scientists who are persecuted from a foreign country over here, we could then possibly recruit them on our end and send them back someday. Finally, I have a chapter about academic conferences and how, particularly in the sciences, they're crawling with spies from all countries. Rather than try and recruit, one nuclear scientist at a university, why not go to some hotel where there's 200 of them? So I think that reporters might do well to take a look at which organizations are having conferences in their city or their area, and take a hard look at the sign-up sheet and maybe see what they can figure out.
Dan, we talked a little bit about how things haven't necessarily changed at places like Marietta College, but there has been impact from your book. What have you seen? What have you noticed?
The greatest impact, somewhat to my surprise and mixed feelings, is that the political right has picked up on it a lot, especially the chapters about Chinese spying. Steve Bannon told one of my colleagues at ProPublica that he loved the book. And that may explain why President Trump a while ago said that almost every student from China is a spy, which of course is a total exaggeration and not true. Similarly, the House Science Committee held hearings at which I testified, talking about the invisibility cloak case. And I kind of bounced between the different parties. I told the Republicans, yes, some Chinese students do spy. And the Democrats, most foreign students are wonderful people who bring a lot to their universities. And I tried to satisfy both sides.
Author John le Carré called your book shocking and timely in his blurb. You shocked a spy master. Was that a particularly proud moment for you?
Oh, it was. I mean, I've loved John le Carré's novels since I was a kid, and that's probably my proudest moment associated with this book. And, I don't know him. We reached out to him out of the blue with no expectation that he would ever respond. So I have to think he actually liked it, and that pleases me very much. And, I tried very hard in this book to show both the activities of foreign intelligence agencies and domestic. I didn't want to make it just an attack on foreign countries, and I didn't want to make it just an attack on the CIA and the FBI. I wanted to show it's a two-way street. And if you read le Carré, one of the great things about him is that moral equivalency. And I was struck again and again in my reporting about how the same techniques that we use, other countries use too. The U.S. is no different in it from any other country, and le Carré portrayed that masterfully. And I'd like to think that my book documents in nonfiction what he showed so beautifully in fiction.
Daniel Golden is the education editor for ProPublica. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, including for the higher education beat while at the Wall Street Journal in 2004. His new book is out in paperback. It's Spy Schools. Dan, thanks for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thank you for listening.